Okay. Elliott Young is a professor of history at Lewis and Clark College, specializing in Latin American history and borderland studies. Today we'll be discussing his book, Alien Nation, Chinese Migration in the Americas from the Coolie Era through World War II, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2014. So thank you for being with me.
Well, I'm happy to be here with you.
Okay, so very first question, I pretty much ask everyone this is, how did you get into the field of history? What made you want to study Chinese migration?
So, getting into the field of history, I guess, goes all the way back to my time in college in the 1980s. And during the 1980s, there were all these wars going on in Central America that the US was involved with. And I took a modern Latin American history class, and it seemed like the best way to understand what was going on in my world at that time was by understanding the history. And so from there, I started studying Latin American history and kind of eventually went to graduate school and continued the study of it. The Chinese migration part of it comes much later. I had written my first book on about a revolutionary on the Texas-Mexico border in the late 19th century. And for my second book project, I was interested in looking at the 1898 war in Cuba. And so I was doing research in the archives in Madrid, in Spain, and I came across all of these references to Chinese in Cuba. And at that point, I had never heard anything about Chinese in Cuba, and it seemed fascinating. And sort of just looking through the sources there, I ended up wanting to explore more generally Chinese migration throughout the Americas, Latin America, and North America.
Was what was the hardest part of this research? So you mentioned you went to Madrid, which is like kind of the big hub for like colonial history of Spain. Um, did you do primarily most research in the US, or did you travel to Latin America at all for archives there? Did you go to China at all for any Chinese archives?
Yeah, I mean, the most difficult thing about a project like this and any transnational project is that it kind of requires you to work in multiple languages, in multiple archives all over the world. And so that can be daunting and takes a lot of time. And so I ended up working in archives in Spain, in the United States, in Cuba, in Mexico, a little bit in Peru for this project, and also in Canada. So it was wide ranging, but sometimes people ask, "Oh, why didn't you talk about the Chinese in Ecuador or the Chinese in Panama?" At a certain point, I felt like I needed to narrow it down to what I thought were the most significant places of Chinese migration at that point. And so there are clearly other countries that I didn't cover. And I also do not read or speak Chinese, so that was another limitation. So I did not do any research in the archives in China. But other scholars who do know Chinese have been doing some of that work. So that's very exciting to see what different perspectives come out in those archives.
So this is like kind of something I've had to kind of deal with and struggle with, and all of my dissertation board is telling me like I need to narrow down because I kind of want to talk about Mennonites more as a network, and like so I want to talk a little bit about them in Mexico and Paraguay and Bolivia, and they're really much like, well, try and find one city in one country, and and really zoom in on that kind of focus. So with that said, I'm kind of I have had to narrow it down quite a bit, but I like the idea of transnational movement and studying transnational history. So my question is, what would you say are the pros and cons of making a transnational history? How do you go about of making like a more hemispheric history rather than a national study or a regional study?
Right. I mean, I think the advice of your advisors is wise advice on the one hand because you want to be able to finish your project. Um, But on the other hand, when you're studying migrants like you are, Mennonites, or like I was, Chinese, who are moving around between countries, if that's the object of your study, then to simply restrict it to a particular country because that's how the archives are organized, I think does, in some sense, does violence or doesn't do justice to the subjects, which are who are transnational subjects. So that being said, I think one has to be realistic about what one can do as a graduate student. You know, it requires a lot of funding to go to multiple countries and multiple to dig into those archives. But to the extent that you can um, branch out from one country and talk about multiple countries, I would encourage you to do that. So if it's the United States and Mexico and maybe, you know, one other country, um, that would be great if you were able to do it. But there are logistical obstacles, which is that archives are organized on the basis of nations. And so it means going to multiple different archives in different countries to get access to that material.
When you were in the process of doing this research, was there any moment that was like an aha moment that like kind of you were thinking about all these moving pieces and then finally you found something or you realized something and they all kind of fit together? So you talked about like Chinese and Cuba was like kind of the starting point. I kind of assumed that when I was reading the book because you mentioned how they were known as being very loyal during the like that was kind of how
Mm.
their perception became that they were very loyal citizens in Cuba because of their participation in the war for independence there. Um, so I kind of suspected that, but then you obviously branch off much further. Uh, was there any kind of aha moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, initially I thought of this, oh, the Chinese in Cuba, this is what I'm gonna focus on the Chinese in Cuba. And then in looking at their stories, I realized that a lot of those Chinese who were in Cuba then came to the United States or went to Mexico. And so, I mean, there's a legitimate study of just the Chinese in Cuba. Kathleen Lopez have written an amazing book called Chinese Cubans that focuses on Cuba. But I wanted to tell a story that was like focused on the migrants themselves across these various borders, and so it kept expanding. And then I, you know, as a Latin Americanist, I, even though I'm a Borderlands person, I was focused on Latin America, and then all of a sudden I was like thinking, how can I leave out the United States from the story since it's actually very central to their story. So I decided to include not only the United States but Canada, and kind of to allow the trajectory of the migrants themselves to dictate what story I was going to tell rather than a predefined, you know, country-based study.
But what was the hardest part of this research?
The hardest part was, I think, the Cuba part, working in the archives in Cuba, which are just, you know, nothing like the conditions that you have in either the United States or even in Mexico, where the archives are tend to be very well organized. Um, you know, digitizing things is easy. In Cuba, you know, the National Archives, there's no air conditioning, so you're sitting there sweating. Getting access to the archives is very difficult. You kind of have to rely on people being willing to bring you stuff, materials, the archivist being willing to bring you materials. And so working in Cuba was hard. And also trying to put together these different pieces of the story from historiographies that are very different. So the historiographies either tend to be like Chinese in Latin America, but mainly it's like Chinese in each particular country. So the Chinese in Mexico, the Chinese in Peru, and very separate from the historiography about the Chinese in the United States or Canada. So it required sort of reading across multiple historiographies, and the study of the Chinese themselves was something which I had not done prior to this project. So it required me familiarizing myself with Chinese history, with Chinese American history, the history of Chinese in the Americas. So it was a lot of sort of reading and introducing myself to new literatures.
Uh, so it's so funny you say that because everyone I know who's gone to Cuba pretty much just says the exact same thing, almost verbatim, where they say like there's no air conditioning in the archive. Like everyone
Yeah.
brings that up. Because you bring up the different historiographies, like we've talked a little bit about archives, but uh, everywhere, every country has its own historiography. That's just kind of seems to be the nature of the history profession. What do you think are the biggest differences between the historiographies in Mexico towards the Chinese, in Cuba towards the Chinese, the United States towards the Chinese, and in Canada towards the Chinese?
Yeah, so I mean, each of these countries has its own historiography. I would say that the historians and scholars that have written about the Chinese in both Cuba and Mexico, it tended to be studies that were more economic or looking at political economy, sort of the role that the Chinese played in, say, in the Cuban economy. It also tended to be very statistically driven about, looking at all of these contracts and finding out what the average age of Chinese coolie contract labor was. In Mexico, there was beginning to be more research done not only within Mexico but also by US based scholars studying the Chinese in Mexico. So there, I think the historiography was a little more developed, looking at the social history of some of these Chinese communities. But I think that the big differences between sort of the U.S. Based studies and the studies in Canada, which I think were much more developed than those in anywhere in Latin America. So there was a richer history of community-based studies that moved beyond simply the economic to looking at cultural issues arising in these Chinese communities in the United States or in Canada. And so that helped me to tell that part of the story because I could rely also on a lot of, in part, on a lot of secondary sources. Whereas for Mexico, Peru, and Cuba, there was some secondary sources, but much less.
So you talk about like the story is about the Chinese, but even I believe in the intro or the first chapter, you talk about how it's actually kind of difficult to talk about the Chinese because I mean China is there's no Chinese language. There's lots of different languages. When I took a Chinese history course, that was like the final question was, what do we mean by when we say Chinese? Because there's all these different regions. You talk about how most of the migrants were actually coming from one particular region in China. What made you choose to then use a broader category of Chinese rather than really emphasizing that it's more of this one region that has
Mhm.
is the primary diaspora? And then can you also tie that in with how many of these Chinese were already in diaspora? Like they were in the Philippines, and then they already have this tradition of migrating, and then
Mhm.
this is just another stop of a migration. Like they already have that tradition.
Yeah, both great questions. So, in terms of the first question was about, remind me, just because I'm lost
Oh,
the track.
why did you choose to talk about
Oh, right,
Chinese
right. The
rather than?
Chinese. Right. So, I think you know, it's true that the vast majority come from this very particular region around the Pearl River Delta. They were all Cantonese speaking people. So to speak about China writ large kind of is a misnomer for who they were. But once they get to to the Americas, those distinctions are completely wiped out or overlooked by the others, the outsiders who are viewing them, and they are become the Chinese. So yeah, so I just decided for the sake of uh, sort of simplicity and for the sake of trying to understand how they were categorized in the Americas using that term Chinese, although I think that it is this conundrum because it kind of reproduces this false sense of, that they're all this singular homogenous nation, which China is not, no nation actually is. And it's the problem of doing transnational history, because even though one is trying to sort of move beyond the nation, you're kind of stuck with the nation. You can't help but talk about the Chinese in Cuba, the Chinese in Mexico, the Chinese in the United States, because these nations existed. The laws were different in these countries, and it mattered which side of the border you were on. So I think doing transnational history is about both obliterating the lines, the border lines of the nation, at the same time as keeping the nation in the frame. And it's kind of a complicated thing where you're doing both at the same time. But doing transnational history does not mean to ignore the fact that nations exist, but rather to try to see those nations and then see beyond the nations what exists beyond them.
And then the second question was, to what extent were these uh, Chinese migrants who, because of push factors, this was the first time they left China and moved to the Americas, and how much of it was this was already a tradition built in? They're actually much more of a diaspora community with a diasporic mentality, moving from one place to the Philippines, to then to Cuba, and
Mm-hmm.
then to Mexico, and then to the U.S.
Right. So there, as you're sort of hinting at, there is this longer tradition of migration to the Philippines, other places in Southeast Asia, that preceded this 19th century migration to the Americas. A lot of those who went to, especially Cuba, Peru, the United States, were directly sort of leaving from the ports, getting on ships, and going to the Americas. Now, for some of them, it wasn't even clear where they were going. They were told they were going to some island, and it's clear that it's not until they're aboard the ships that they realize they're not going to the Philippines, but they're going across the ocean to the Americas. But there's also the story of internal migration. So these people, a lot of them come from the interior of that region in China and then come to the coast to either to work in these port towns like Hong Kong or the other Macau, these other towns that are controlled by European powers. And it's there that they get indebted, and that leads to their then contracting on these coolie ships. So I think there's both a story of internal Chinese migration or migration from the interior to the coast, as well as that story of migration to other places in Southeast Asia and prior to coming to the Americas.
What, if any, would you say is the importance of this transnational network to Chinese success and their further migration and further movement? So there's this idea of like chain migration. It's been like I've done a bit of German studies because Mennonites kind of fit into German studies, although they're a little different. And a lot has been written about how migrants typically they migrate from one locality to another locality. At least the Germans did. You kind of are talking about this in a different way where they don't even really know where they're going once they're getting on the book or on the boat. Um, but once those initial points of contact are established, did they form like a transnational network that kind of aided each other as they moved around?
Yeah, so when I'm talking about people getting on boats and not knowing where I'm going, I'm talking about the so-called coolie trade, so
Hmm.
contract laborers, which didn't depend on sort of kinship networks or friends, because they were going contracted by the Spanish, in the case of Cuba, the Spanish government oversaw, the Spanish crown oversaw the whole process, and then they were sold off basically to plantation owners. The contracts were in Cuba, so in those cases it was less about the contacts that they had. But I think in Mexico, the United States, Canada, and in Cuba post the Coolie era in 1874, the networks, the pre-existing networks, were key to determining where people would go and their ability to get jobs in those places, to survive in those places. And then once they're in the Americas, they have this whole communication network in the diaspora across different countries. So someone will arrive to Canada and hear from a relative or a friend in either the United States or in Cuba or in Mexico that there are jobs there, and then they would go there and they would these networks were facilitated by hometown associations from China, as well as Tongs, or these kind of triad associations that existed, and political organizations. So all of that kind of linked up the Chinese in diaspora across national lines.
What would you say is the differences then between the Chinese migrations and then other migrations? I mean, you kind of talk about how there's like a spectrum of freedom. They're not quite the same as indentured servants, uh, but they're not quite the slave Atlantic slave trade. Um, so there's like the spectrum of freedom, and you kind of place them on the middle. Uh, how do they compare with other migrations to Latin America or elsewhere, like the Japanese migrants who went to Brazil or other?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the we could separate the Asians in general from other migrants from European countries, in that, and even the Africans to some extent, in that their religion was very different. They weren't Christians for the most part, and they were seen as being alien, as being others, in terms of their culture, their language, all of those ways racially. And so I think that the ability to assimilate, integrate into the societies where they arrived was more difficult than for some other migrant groups. Um, so I would say that's the main difference. The Chinese versus Japanese, I think by the time you get to the late 19th, early 20th century, you do have some Japanese coming over who end up working as kind of farm labor, both in the United States and in other places in Latin America, like Brazil, and Peru. Uh, but I think the bulk of the Chinese population, first of all, was a much larger migration that came earlier, and didn't have the representation of a major power like the Japanese was at the beginning of the 20th century. The Chinese obviously was a big country, but it was kind of in decline. There were all these political struggles going on, and so the Chinese were not well represented by the Chinese government, and therefore lacked the protection, and oftentimes had to rely on the protection of either the United States or England or some other European power, versus the Chinese government, which, in the middle of the 19th century didn't even have official diplomatic representatives in all of these countries. So that sort of led to their more increasing vulnerability. And there was also the fact that the official position of the Chinese government was that migration was illegal. So there was kind of not the idea of trying to protect the Chinese that emigrated, but that these people were had kind of left in violation of the law.
So, in your book, you say, as citizenship was extended more broadly, the idea of the illegal alien, the outsider on the inside, emerged. And I read a couple reviews in preparation for this interview, one of which kind of suggests that what you're saying is that the more democratic a nation becomes, the more exclusionary its policies, its immigration policies become. Uh, would you agree with that assessment, or what exactly are you trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, there is this strange phenomenon where the I think one would hope that democracy would lead to greater inclusiveness, but the more expansive the democracy becomes, then there seems to be this need to separate out the rights that citizens have versus non-citizens. And so it becomes this need to find an other, a rightless other against whom to define the citizenship rights of the people who are citizens of that country. And the other study by culling the book by Fitzgerald and I'm forgetting the other name, but the culling the masses basically does this broad sociological study of the Chinese throughout the Americas and makes the argument that where you have more democracy, you saw more violence and more restrictions against the Chinese. And of course, in the United States, it was precisely kind of the democratic um, inclusion of white working class people that led to the pressures. Well, first of all, led to a lot of mob violence against Chinese, but then also led to the pressure that ultimately led to Chinese exclusion. So in that sense, the one could see from like the top levels of government there being an interest in increasing trade with China, but from the perspective of the white working classes, the Chinese were seen as a threat, economic threat. And so as those groups become more enfranchised, more powerful, they're able to exert um, some pressure on the government to pursue more restrictionist policies.
Okay, interesting. Is it more democratic or more maybe like class consciousness where because
Yeah, I mean,
I've read that the debates in Brazil, the uh the fact that the Chinese did not were not gonna acclimate to the culture was actually seen as a good thing by several Brazilian capitalists because then they saw that as like labor that would be very easy to control and then kind of uh, uh, contend against the Brazilian working class.
mhm.
So do you see any of that, or do you would you agree
Yeah,
with that?
yeah, no, I think that for capitalists, for plantation owners, for the farm lobby in the United States, the idea of having immigrants coming in who are easily exploited is all has always been a good thing. And it is more the people who are in the working class who feel that they are in direct competition with these other workers, and in some sense, they're right about that. So it's not in their interest, in other words, to have more free migration, but it's certainly in the interest of global trade, in the interest of capitalist interests to have these groups come in. And if yeah, the idea that they'll come in, work, but won't assimilate then alleviates issue that some people had of this idea of the degeneration of the race by intermixing with the Chinese. So in some sense, the fact that these groups were seen as being isolated was seen as a positive aspect by capitalists and other groups who needed the labor but didn't necessarily want them to integrate into their society.
So kind of getting into that, because I know you also do work with present immigration debates. But what do you think are the similarities and differences between how immigration was talked about, the Chinese migration was talked about in the US at the turn of the century, and how migration is talked about presently?
So there's a lot of similarities and through lines, and part of the point of the book is to make those connections or to alert people to those connections. So when we think, I think today about the so-called illegal alien, undocumented migrant, I think most people are thinking about Mexicans or more recently Central Americans. But the origin of that idea, I think, is the Chinese migrant to the United States. The idea that they are criminals, that they are somehow a danger to the cultural fabric of our society, that they're economic competitors, so they're going to sort of take jobs away. All of that, starts off with the Chinese, and we could see, turning on Fox News today, you'll see the same kind of rhetoric being used about present day migrants coming. So I think that that's a common trope that runs throughout, all of these histories.
Uh, just two more questions. What is the Boatland Institute for Transnational History of the Americas? I went to the website and it kind of seems like it's a conference, but somewhat informal. I don't know. I was just curious
Yeah,
about how
good
it's set
good
up.
question. So in 2003, Tepoztlán is a small town an hour from Mexico City, and when I was doing dissertation research in Mexico in the 1990s, a friend, colleague, and I would go there and do writing. And so 2003, I had was about to come up for tenure, and one of the laments that this colleague Pam Vokel and I had was that when we go to the American Historical Association or any of these big history conferences, that there isn't very good conversation. There's not time to have a good conversation. You do your panel, maybe you get one or two questions, and then you're off to the next panel. So we thought, why not try to create the anti-conference where people would live together for a week. It would be kind of summer camp, like no one would be presenting their papers orally, but everyone would have to read them ahead of time, and the focus would be on the discussion. And so the first year, 2004, we did this. 30 people came, and we were all sort of had all the sessions together in one house. And the idea kind of just took off from there because the people who came said, this is I've gotten the best feedback on my work that I've ever gotten. This has been like much better than any other conference. And so for the last 20 years now, we've been meeting, and the theme changes, the directors change. And yeah, we've explored a number of different topics related to transnational studies. They're mainly historians, but there's also people who do literature, anthropologists, sociologists, activists, artists. So it tries to be your non-traditional conference. And there's a cabaret that happens on Saturday night where people have to try to integrate what they've been reading, the theoretical readings they've been doing, into a cabaret skit. And so it's trying to get academics to take themselves less seriously, which is a hard task sometimes.
Okay, very interesting. And then the final question, besides your own book, what is one book in your field that you would recommend everyone should be reading?
Besides my book. Yes, good. That's a great question. The one on the top of my mind now is Kelly Lytle Hernandez's Bad Mexicans, which came out recently, and it's about the history of the Flores Magon brothers, who were anarchists who were part of the Mexican Revolution, but ended up during the Mexican Revolution in the United States, involved with radical political organizing in the United States. And the leader of that group, Ricardo Flores Magon, ends up in Fort Leavenworth Penitentiary and dies in 1923 there. And so that it's just a very well written story that tries to recover this history that is known in Mexico but less known in the United States about these sort of radical anarchist Mexicans and their struggle against Porfirio Diaz and global capitalism. And sometimes those stories, which, you know, they in the end, I think, fail to succeed in turning Mexico into the sort of socialist anarchist paradise that they wanted, but the legacy of those stories is important to sort of recover um, for our present day communities, trying to understand the possibilities for change both in Mexico and in the United States.
Yeah, I think there's an online archive of their newspapers or their newspaper
Yeah,
articles. Yeah, I think I've
yeah,
come across that.
yeah. Regeneracion was their newspaper, and you can get some of them online, and it's kind of amazing to read, you know, because they were not only for redistributing land, they were for, you know, against the church, against private property, for free love. I mean, they're kind of like on the extreme end of the Mexican Revolution. But yeah, they have this fascinating transnational story that that Kelly's book just tells in a really captivating way.
All right, perfect.